Story 1. The Watcher at the Hospital. It was Jackson's first week working the night shift at St. Martin's Hospital. The pay was good, and it was quiet. Too quiet. The hospital had a reputation for being understaffed and somewhat run down, but the eerie silence after midnight unnerved him. The nurses joked about how the third floor was haunted, but Jackson didn't believe in that stuff. He thought it was just a way to scare the newbies. One night, as Jackson was making his rounds, he noticed something strange. The lights on the third floor flickered on and off. At first, he brushed it off as a faulty electrical system, but it kept happening. Each night, the flickering grew more intense, as if something was trying to get his attention. The nurses avoided that floor unless absolutely necessary. They whispered about a man who had died there, a former patient, who had been a long-term resident and passed away under mysterious circumstances. One night, Jackson had to go to the third floor to restock supplies. As he stepped out of the elevator, the flickering lights began again. The air was thick with a damp, moldy smell. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He hurried down the hallway, wanting to finish the task as quickly as possible. But just as he reached the supply closet, he heard a soft, raspy whisper. "Help me!" Jackson froze. His heart pounded in his chest, and cold sweat formed on his forehead. He spun around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, this time closer. "Help me!" He turned his flashlight on, the beam bouncing off the empty hallway. Nothing moved, but the whisper continued, now coming from inside the supply closet. Trembling, Jackson reached for the door handle, slowly pulling it open. His flashlight revealed nothing but shelves of medical supplies. But then, something caught his eye. On the back wall of the closet, there was a handprint. It looked fresh, smeared with something dark. His mind raced. Was it blood? Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. Jackson panicked and banged on the door, but no one came. The whisper now surrounded him, filling the small space. "Help me." He felt a cold hand brush against his neck. Gasping, he turned to face the back of the closet, and there, standing in the shadow, was the outline of a man. His eyes were sunken, his face pale and gaunt. The man reached out a hand, the same one that had left the print on the wall. Jackson screamed, banging harder on the door until, finally, it burst open. He stumbled out into the hallway, panting and drenched in sweat. The hallway was empty, and the lights had stopped flickering. The next morning, Jackson handed in his resignation. He never spoke about what happened that night, but the nurses knew. The man who died on the third floor had never really left. Story 2. The Shadow in the Warehouse. Tom had been working the night shift at the old picking warehouse for months. It was mostly a quiet job, checking deliveries, making rounds, and keeping an eye on things. The warehouse was enormous, with towering shelves that stretched toward the ceiling, and rows of crates and packages waiting to be shipped. It was lonely, but Tom didn't mind the peace. One night, as he was doing his usual rounds, something felt off. The air was colder than usual, and the silence seemed deeper. His footsteps echoed in the vastness, but they weren't the only sounds he heard. There was something else, a faint shuffling noise. He paused, listening carefully. It came from somewhere deep within the rows of crates. He called out, thinking maybe one of the other workers had stayed late. No one answered. The shuffling continued, growing louder. Tom's pulse quickened as he grabbed his flashlight and followed the sound. It led him to the far corner of the warehouse, where the lights barely reached, casting long shadows between the crates. He shone his flashlight down the narrow path between two towering shelves. At the end of the row, something moved. It was too dark to see clearly, but there was a figure standing there, motionless, watching. Tom swallowed hard, trying to keep calm. "Hey, who's there?" he called out, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, its form blending into the darkness. Tom took a step closer, and the figure moved, not toward him, but sideways, slipping behind the crates like a shadow. His breath hitched. Something about the way it moved was unnatural, like it wasn't walking, but gliding. He cautiously approached the spot where the figure had been, his heart pounding in his chest. He shone the flashlight over the area, but there was no one there. The air around him felt wrong, thick, like it was pressing in on him. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a scraping sound behind him. He spun around, and there it was, the shadowy figure standing just a few feet away. This time, it was clearer, though still shrouded in darkness. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that stretched toward the floor. Its face, or what should have been a face, was hidden in the shadows, but Tom could feel it watching him. Panicking, he backed away, but the figure moved too, sliding closer. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the warehouse as the figure followed, always just out of the corner of his eye. No matter how fast he ran, it stayed with him, never making a sound. Finally, he reached the office at the front of the warehouse and slammed the door behind him, locking it. He stood there, panting, his back against the door. The air was still, silent once again. He dared to peek through the small window on the door, and for a moment, he saw nothing. Then, slowly, the shadowy figure emerged from the darkness. It stood at the far end of the aisle, just watching. It didn't move closer, but it didn't leave either. Tom stayed locked in that office until the morning shift arrived, and by then, the shadow had disappeared. He quit the next day. The manager didn't believe him when he explained why, but the older workers knew. There were stories about that warehouse, stories Tom wished he had listened to. Story 3. The Midnight Patient. Anna worked the night shift at a small, rural clinic. Most nights were uneventful, with only the occasional emergency or late-night checkup. But one night, something changed. It was around 2 a.m. when an elderly woman was brought in by an ambulance. The paramedics told Anna that they found the woman wandering on the side of the road, mumbling incoherently. She had no ID, and no one knew where she came from. Anna took the woman to one of the examination rooms, trying to get her to speak. The woman stared blankly ahead, her eyes clouded, and muttered something that Anna couldn't understand. Her skin was cold to the touch, and she had a strange odor, like damp earth and rotting leaves. As Anna examined her, the woman suddenly grabbed her wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "He's coming," the woman whispered, her eyes wide and wild. "Who's coming?" Anna asked, trying to pull her hand away, but the woman wouldn't let go. "He's coming for me. He knows I'm here." Anna managed to free herself and backed away. She tried to calm the woman, but nothing worked. The woman started to rock back and forth, repeating, he's coming," over and over again. Anna left the room to get help, but when she returned with the doctor, the woman was gone. The bed was empty, the door still locked from the inside. The doctor looked at Anna like she was crazy, but they searched the clinic from top to bottom. There was no sign of the old woman. Later that night, as Anna sat at her desk trying to make sense of what had happened, the lights in the clinic flickered. The temperature dropped, and a cold breeze blew through the hallway, even though all the windows were closed. Then, from the direction of the exam room, she heard it, the sound of soft footsteps. They echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. Please let me know if this is still the style and length you're looking for. If so, I'll continue with the remaining stories. Story 4. The Figure at the Gas Station. Ryan had worked the graveyard shift at a small, run-down gas station for years. The quiet, deserted highway that ran alongside the station rarely saw any traffic at night, and most of his time was spent alone behind the counter, flipping through magazines or watching late-night TV. One night, around 3 a.m., the station was unusually quiet. Not a single car had passed by for hours. Ryan sat at the counter, feeling the weight of the silence. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights above, buzzing faintly. Out of nowhere, the lights began to flicker. He glanced up, annoyed, but it wasn't unusual for the old place. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment, when the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside made him freeze. He sat up, peering out the large window facing the pumps. A figure was standing by the farthest pump, barely visible in the dim glow of the station's weak lights. The person was facing away, wearing what looked like a dark, hooded coat. Ryan's first instinct was to call out, but something about the way the figure stood, completely still, sent a shiver down his spine. He grabbed the microphone for the station's outside speaker and spoke into it. "Can I help you with something?" His voice echoed in the empty lot. The figure didn't move. He stared harder, trying to make out more details, but the figure remained unnaturally still. The only thing moving was the light breeze tugging at the hood of the coat. Ryan's heart began to pound. Something was wrong. He reached under the counter, grabbing the baseball bat he kept for safety, and cautiously stepped outside. The air was cold, colder than it had been all night. He approached the figure slowly, the bat gripped tightly in his hand. "Hey buddy, you okay?" Ryan called out, trying to sound calm. No response. He was only a few feet away now, close enough to touch the figure. His breath caught in his throat as he reached out, his hand trembling, and tapped the figure on the shoulder. The coat collapsed. Ryan jumped back, staring in disbelief. The coat lay crumpled on the ground, as if there had never been anyone wearing it. He took a step back, his heart racing, when he heard footsteps again, this time from behind him. He spun around, bat raised, but there was no one there, only the empty gas station and the silent highway beyond. The flickering lights buzzed above him, and the cold air pressed in from all sides. Ryan hurried back inside, locking the door behind him. He sat at the counter, gripping the bat in both hands, and watched the empty parking lot until the sun finally rose. The figure never came back, but every night since then, Ryan swore he could hear the sound of footsteps outside, always at 3 a.m. The last patient. Jessica was a nurse on the night shift at a small hospital that had seen better days. The fluorescent lights flickered above her as she walked the empty halls, checking in on the few patients who occupied the rooms. The quiet hum of the machines was a comforting sound, almost like a lullaby, but tonight something felt off. Around midnight, Jessica received a call from the nurses' station. "We have a new admission in room 204, the voice said. "A Mr. Bat Thompson. Make sure to check on him regularly. He's in for observation." "Sure thing," Jessica replied, her voice steady despite the creeping unease that settled in her stomach. Room 204 had been empty for weeks, and the thought of a new patient stirred a sense of dread within her. As she approached the room, the air grew colder. She knocked gently before entering. Inside, she found a frail old man lying in bed, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull, and he looked at her with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," she said, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling?" He coughed weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming for me. You have to help me." "Who's coming?" Jessica asked, her heart racing. "Is it someone from your past?" He shook his head, sweat glistening on his forehead. "No, not them. The ones from the dark. They're always watching. You have to lock the door." Jessica's unease deepened, but she tried to remain calm. "Okay, I'll lock the door, Mr. Thompson. Just try to relax." She stepped out to secure the door, but when she turned back, the old man's eyes were wide with terror. "They're here," he screamed. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness for a brief moment. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she rushed back to the bed. The old man was shaking violently now, his fingers gripping the sheets as if he were holding on for dear life. "Mr. Thompson, I'm here! You're safe with me," she reassured him, though she felt anything but safe. Suddenly, the lights returned, but the atmosphere had changed. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, twisting and turning like living creatures. Jessica glanced around the room, searching for any sign of what the old man had feared. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, growing louder, surrounding her. "Help him! Help him!" Panic set in as she looked back at Mr. Thompson. His eyes were rolling back in his head, and he began to convulse. Jessica grabbed the phone to call for help, but before she could dial, the whispers intensified, drowning out her thoughts. "They're coming." In that instant, the door swung open, and the head nurse rushed in. "What's happening?" she shouted, her eyes darting around the room. Jessica pointed at Mr. Thompson, who had gone still. The nurse rushed to the bed, checking for a pulse, but there was none. "He's gone," she murmured, her voice filled with disbelief. "No, he was just—" Jessica stammered, feeling a cold grip around her heart. The whispers faded, but a heaviness lingered in the air. Days later, as Jessica sat in the break room, the head nurse entered, her face pale. "You won't believe this," she said. "Mr. Thompson's family called. They said he had a history of talking about shadows and dark figures watching him. They thought he was delusional." Jessica's blood ran cold. "He wasn't crazy. I heard them." The nurse shook her head. "You need to let it go. It's just a coincidence." But Jessica knew better. She felt the shadows lingering, watching, waiting for her next move. The Night Watcher. Tom was a security guard at the old Crestwood Asylum, a place notorious for its gruesome history and abandoned halls. The night shift was often dull, marked by the creaking of old wood and the distant rustle of leaves outside. But one night, everything changed. As Tom began his rounds, he noticed a faint light flickering in the east wing, a section long sealed off. He frowned, recalling the warnings of his colleagues about that part of the building. He grabbed his flashlight and made his way down the darkened hall. Pushing open the door, he stepped into the musty air. Dust motes danced in his flashlight beam as he scanned the area. Old wheelchairs lay abandoned, and the walls were adorned with peeling paint and forgotten memories. Suddenly, he heard a low groan echoing from the end of the hall. Tom hesitated, but curiosity pushed him forward. As he walked, the air grew colder, and he felt a chill run down his spine. At the end of the corridor, he found a door slightly ajar. The light was spilling out, casting eerie shadows on the floor. Tom knocked lightly. "Hello? Is anyone in there?" "Help!" a voice croaked from within. Tom pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with old medical equipment. In the corner sat a disheveled figure, hunched over and trembling. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaking. The figure looked up, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to pull Tom in. "I need to get out of here. They won't let me go." "Who won't?" Tom asked, taking a cautious step forward. "They're always watching," the man said, his gaze darting around the room. "They want to keep me here forever." Tom's heart raced as the man suddenly lunged for him, gripping his arm with a cold, clammy hand. "Please, you have to help me." Okay, let's get you out of here," Tom said, trying to pry the man's fingers from his arm. He quickly assessed the room. The door they had entered through was still open, but he could hear footsteps approaching from behind. "Run!" the man shouted, and without thinking, Tom took off down the hall, dragging the man with him. As they sprinted through the asylum, the echoes of their footsteps filled the air. The man gasped for breath, his eyes wide with fear. "They're coming! You have to hurry!" Just as they reached the exit, the lights flickered and went out. Tom's heart sank. He fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he glanced back at the hallway, now shrouded in darkness. "Please, don't leave me," the man cried. Tom felt a surge of determination. "Hold on, I'll find a way out." He felt along the wall for an emergency exit, but it was like running in circles. The man's grip on his arm tightened as he sobbed. "They're here." In the distance, Tom heard whispers. No, not whispers, shouts, growing louder. It was as if the asylum itself was alive, awakening to the chaos. "Help!" Tom shouted, banging on the door. "Someone, please help us!" Suddenly, the door flew open, and Tom stumbled into the night air, dragging the man with him. They collapsed on the grass outside, gasping for breath. The moonlight illuminated their faces, revealing the terror etched into the man's features. "I can't go back," he said, shaking uncontrollably. "They'll find me." Tom looked back at the asylum, the shadows pooling around the building as if hungry for their escape. He knew he had to get the man to safety. "Come on, we need to get as far away from here as possible." As they ran toward the street, Tom could still hear the shouts behind them, echoing into the night. The midnight caller. Megan was working the night shift at a local convenience store, a job she had taken to make ends meet. The store was usually quiet, save for the occasional late-night customer. But one night, as she restocked the shelves, the phone rang. She answered it, her voice bright. "Good evening, Country Mart. How can I help you?" Silence hung on the line for a moment before a raspy voice finally spoke. "I see you." Megan's heart raced. "Excuse me, who is this?" "You're all alone, aren't you?" the voice said, dripping with malice. "I'm going to hang up now," she said firmly, trying to keep her composure. But before she could, the line went dead. She shivered, looking around the dim store, feeling the weight of isolation settle over her. Not long after, the bell above the door jingled, and a man walked in. He looked disheveled, his eyes darting around nervously. "Do you have any cigarettes?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah, they're in the back," Megan replied, eyeing him warily. "Just follow me." As she led him to the cigarette display, the man kept glancing toward the entrance, as if expecting someone to follow him. Megan felt her skin crawl. "Are you okay?" she asked, attempting to break the tension. "I'm fine," he said quickly, but there was a wildness in his eyes. Suddenly, the phone rang again. Megan hesitated before answering. "Country Mart, how can I help you? I'm closer than you think," the voice taunted. Her heart raced. She looked at the man, who was now staring at her with a mix of fear and curiosity. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I think so," she stammered, her instincts screaming for her to get out of there. The man moved closer, his demeanor shifting. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said, his eyes narrowing. "It's dangerous." "What do you mean?" Megan asked, confusion flooding her mind. Before he could respond, the door swung open, and a group of rowdy teenagers stumbled in, laughter echoing through the store. Megan felt a rush of relief, but also confusion. The man's face twisted in anger as he glared at the newcomers. "You shouldn't be here," he shouted, taking a step back. Megan stepped away from him, unsure of what to do. "Can I help you with something?" she asked the teenagers, desperate for a distraction. But the man suddenly lunged at them, knocking over a display of chips. "Get out! Get out now!" he screamed. The teenagers froze, shock and confusion on their faces. Megan quickly grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "Help! I need help at Country Mart," she said, her voice shaking. The operator assured her that help was on the way. The man continued to shout, and the teenagers began to back away. "What's wrong with you?" one of them shouted, looking terrified. Megan watched as the man's eyes darted toward her, realization dawning on him. He took a step back, fear replacing the rage. I just wanted to be safe," he mumbled, looking lost. As the sirens wailed in the distance, Megan stepped toward the man, her heart racing. "You don't have to be afraid. Just stay calm." When the police arrived, they took control of the situation. The man was escorted outside, where he explained he had received a series of threatening calls, making him paranoid. Megan breathed a sigh of relief, knowing the danger had passed, but the phone's ominous voice echoed in her mind, reminding her of how quickly things could turn. The final delivery. In a small, run-down pizza place, Alex was working the night shift, his hours often stretching late into the night. He was used to delivering pizza to the neighborhood, but one order stood out. "Just drive to the end of Ravenwood Lane," the customer had instructed, voice muffled and strange over the phone. "You'll find the address there." Alex grabbed the pizza and hopped into his car, feeling a sense of unease. Ravenwood Lane was notorious for being dark and desolate, lined with trees that seemed to close in on the road. As he drove deeper into the lane, the streetlights flickered and then went out completely, leaving him in pitch darkness. His heart raced as he turned on his headlights, the beam illuminating the twisted branches that loomed overhead. When he finally reached the address, it was a decrepit house, its windows shattered and door hanging off its hinges. The air felt thick, and an unsettling silence enveloped him. He hesitated, then decided to approach the front door, pizza in hand. "Hello?" he called, stepping onto the creaky porch. "I have your pizza." The door creaked open, revealing a shadowy figure inside. "Come in," the figure rasped, and Alex felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm just leaving it here," he said, trying to remain calm. But as he turned to leave, the figure stepped closer, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes. "Stay," it demanded, voice low and commanding. Panic surged through Alex as he backed away, but the figure moved with surprising speed, blocking his escape. "You're not going anywhere," it hissed, and Alex felt the walls closing in on him. Thinking quickly, he tossed the pizza at the figure's face and sprinted for the door. He flung it open and bolted into the night, his heart pounding in his chest. As he ran down the lane, he could hear footsteps behind him, echoing through the night. He pushed himself harder, adrenaline fueling his flight. He could see the glow of his car in the distance, and he sprinted toward it, praying he'd make it in time. When he reached the car, he fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking. Just as he got the door open, he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He whirled around, ready to fight, but there was nothing there, only darkness behind him. Shaking, he jumped into the car and slammed the door, locking it. He started the engine and tore down the lane, the figure's haunting eyes etched into his memory. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was no one there, just the empty road behind him. The experience would haunt him for nights to come. The last shift. Lila had worked the night shift at Cedar Creek Hospital for over 2 years. The night staff was small, and the few of them formed a tight-knit bond, sharing laughs and stories during their midnight coffee breaks. However, on this particular night, a sense of unease hung in the air, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. As Lila entered the break room for her shift, she noticed the faint flicker of the overhead lights. "Hey, is anyone else feeling this weird vibe tonight?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Mason, one of the night nurses, looked up from his phone, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, I was just saying the same thing. It's like the place is haunted or something." "Don't say that. You'll give me nightmares," Lila laughed nervously, trying to shake off the feeling. She had always dismissed ghost stories as silly, but tonight she felt a chill creeping up her spine. After her break, Lila was assigned to check on the patients in the West Wing. The corridor was dimly lit, and the air felt heavy. She pushed through the swinging doors and headed to room 205, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove had been recovering from surgery. "Good evening, Mrs. Hargrove," Lila said cheerfully as she entered. The woman lay in bed, her face pale and frail. "How are you feeling tonight?" "Strange things are happening, dear," Mrs. Hargrove whispered, her voice shaky. "I hear whispers at night, and sometimes I see things that shouldn't be there." Lila chuckled lightly, trying to ease the woman's fears. "You're probably just a bit groggy from the medication. It's normal after surgery." But Mrs. Hargrove shook her head vigorously. "No, it's real. I see shadows moving in the corners, and I feel like someone is watching me." The nurse's smile faded, replaced by a sense of dread. "I'll check your vitals and see if we can adjust your medication," she replied, trying to focus on her duties. As she took the woman's blood pressure, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. The shadows seemed to shift and flicker, though she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. After finishing her checks, she promised Mrs. Hargrove she'd be back shortly and stepped out into the hallway. The corridor was even quieter now, the only sound being the distant beep of medical equipment. As she walked toward the nurse's station, she noticed a figure at the far end of the hall. It was a man in a hospital gown, his hair disheveled and his eyes wide with fear. "Help! Somebody help me!" he cried, his voice echoing down the hall. Lila rushed toward him, concern flooding her mind. "What's wrong? Are you lost?" "I can't find my way back. They're coming for me," he gasped, eyes darting around as if he could see something lurking in the shadows. "Who's coming?" Lila asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "Please, you have to help me," he pleaded, gripping her arm tightly. Just then, the lights flickered again, and the man's expression shifted to one of terror. "They're here," he shouted, stumbling back. Before Lila could react, he turned and sprinted away down the hall. Confused and worried, she hesitated before following him. As she chased after him, the air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch out, reaching for her. She lost sight of him as he turned a corner, and when she rounded the bend, he was gone. The hallway was empty, and a heavy silence descended. Heart racing, Lila felt a chill run down her spine. "Where did he go?" she whispered to herself. Returning to the nurse's station, she reported the incident to Mason. "I just saw a patient running down the hall. He was terrified, talking about someone coming for him. I don't know where he went." Mason's face paled. "That sounds like Jonathan. He was admitted last week after a mental health crisis. He's been off his meds. We need to find him before he hurts himself," Lila urged, feeling a sense of urgency wash over her. They split up to search the hospital, calling out for Jonathan. As Lila walked through the West Wing again, she heard faint whispers, growing louder as she approached room 210. She pushed the door open, revealing a darkened room. "Jonathan?" she called, stepping inside. The room felt eerily cold, and as she switched on the light, she found it empty, save for the curtains fluttering in the draft. Then she noticed the bed. The sheets were tossed aside, and a small pile of clothes lay on the floor. "Where did you go?" she murmured, feeling a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Lila's heart raced. She turned to leave when she heard the whispers again, this time clearer. "Get out!" Startled, she stumbled backward, only to bump into something solid. She whirled around to find Jonathan standing there, his eyes wide with terror. "They're here!" he screamed, pointing toward the darkened corner of the room. "Who's here?" Lila asked, fear gripping her heart. The ones in the walls, they're watching me. Jonathan shrieked, his voice rising in pitch. Before she could respond, the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Panic surged through Lila as she fumbled for her phone, its screen casting a faint glow. "Stay close to me," she called, feeling the darkness pressing in around them. Jonathan's breathing grew erratic. "I can't, they'll get me." He turned to run, but Lila grabbed his arm, desperate to keep him with her. "Jonathan, listen to me. We need to get out of here," she shouted, her heart racing as she heard the whispers again, louder and more insistent. "Get out! Get out!" the voices chanted, echoing in her mind. She could feel the shadows closing in, and terror gripped her as she realized they weren't alone. In a flash of inspiration, Lila dragged Jonathan toward the door, forcing him to move. "This way," she yelled, pushing through the darkness. Suddenly, the whispers returned, now clearer and more menacing. "You shouldn't have come here." Panic surged within Lila. "Mason, we need to get out. Something is wrong." As they rushed down the hallway, the lights flickered back on, but Lila could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon them. They reached the main entrance just as the lights went out again, leaving them in darkness. "Run!" Mason shouted, and they sprinted toward the exit. As they reached the front doors, Lila glanced back, catching a glimpse of shadowy figures standing in the hallway, watching them with empty eyes. They burst through the doors, gasping for air as they stumbled outside into the cool night. But the whispers faded into the night, leaving them with a chilling realization. The hospital held dark secrets, and they had only scratched the surface. The abandoned warehouse. Nick had taken a part-time job as a security guard for an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place had a long history of being a storage facility, but rumors swirled about it being haunted. Nick dismissed the stories, but every night shift felt like a test of his courage. On his first night alone, he patrolled the dimly lit aisles filled with dusty crates and old machinery. The flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. After a few hours of monotonous rounds, he settled into his small office, sipping on cold coffee and scrolling through his phone. Suddenly, he heard a loud bang echo through the warehouse. Startled, he bolted upright, adrenaline coursing through him. "What the hell was that?" he muttered to himself, grabbing his flashlight and heading toward the sound. The noise had come from the loading dock at the back of the building. As he approached, he noticed the large metal door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. He pushed it open, shining his light into the darkness beyond. The loading dock was empty, but something felt off. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the silence. No answer. He stepped inside, the door creaking ominously behind him. Suddenly, a figure darted past the corner of his vision. Nick jumped, his heart racing. "Who's there?" he shouted, trying to sound braver than he felt. A laugh echoed through the shadows, a deep, throaty sound that sent shivers down his spine. Nick's instincts kicked in, and he backed away toward the exit. "This isn't funny," he yelled, gripping his flashlight tightly. He turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping him inside. Panic surged within him as he banged on the metal door. "Let me out! This isn't a joke!" The laughter grew louder, and Nick could hear footsteps approaching. He turned to face the darkness, and to his horror, a figure emerged. A tall man dressed in tattered clothing, with wild hair and an unsettling grin. "You shouldn't have come here," the man rasped, his eyes gleaming with a manic intensity. Nick's heart raced as he darted toward a nearby stack of crates, climbing over them to put distance between himself and the strange man. "What do you want?" he shouted, desperate to buy time. "The shadows are hungry," the man replied, his voice low and chilling. "They're always hungry for more." With a surge of adrenaline, Nick grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and brandished it as a weapon. "Stay back," he warned, his voice shaky but determined. The man laughed again, a cruel sound that echoed through the empty space. "You think you can fight them? They're already here." Before Nick could react, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged as he swung the pipe wildly, hoping to fend off the unseen threat. "Get out! Get out!" The man's voice echoed in the blackness, and Nick could feel a cold breath on his neck. In a moment of sheer terror, he bolted toward the door, pounding on it with all his strength. "Help! "Somebody help me!" he screamed, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. Just as he thought he would be trapped forever, the door swung open, and the night air flooded in. Nick stumbled outside, gasping for breath, and turned to see the man standing at the threshold, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Run, little guard. They're waiting for you." Nick didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward his car, heart racing as he fumbled for his keys. He jumped inside and locked the doors, panting heavily. As he glanced back at the warehouse, he saw shadows swirling at the entrance, as if the darkness itself was alive. The man stood at the door, watching him with an unsettling intensity. Nick started the engine and sped away, the warehouse fading into the distance. But the laughter haunted him, echoing in his mind long after he left. Haunted Asylum. Laura had taken the night shift at the old Crestwood Asylum, a crumbling structure long abandoned and rumored to be haunted. She needed the extra money and was drawn to the thrill of working in such a mysterious place. Her supervisor had given her a strict set of rules. Stay in the main building, don't wander off, and never, under any circumstances, go into the basement. As she settled into the front office, the creaking of the building echoed around her, and she could feel the weight of its history pressing down. Hours passed slowly, the silence almost suffocating. She flipped through an old magazine and tried to focus on anything but the eerie feeling settling in her stomach. Just as she began to relax, she heard a faint whisper. "Help me." The sound sent chills down her spine. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Heart pounding, Laura grabbed her flashlight and jumped to her feet. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer, just the echo of her own fear. She made her way to the door and stepped into the dimly lit hallway. The air felt thick, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward her, pulling her in. She moved cautiously, shining her flashlight down the corridor. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floor creaked under her weight. As she approached the end of the hall, she heard the whisper again, clearer this time. "Help me!" "Who's there?" Laura demanded, her voice echoing. She felt a cold breeze sweep past her, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around her. "Help me, in the basement." Without thinking, she turned toward the stairs leading down to the basement. She knew she shouldn't, but something compelled her to go. As she descended, the air grew colder, and the whispers turned into frantic cries. "Please, help me." At the bottom of the stairs, she found a heavy door. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. The basement was dark and damp, filled with old medical equipment and discarded files. "Where are you?" she called, her voice trembling. The cries intensified, echoing in the darkness. As she stepped further inside, the door slammed shut behind her. Panic surged as she rushed back, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the door. The cries turned into screams, and Laura felt her heart race. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice shrieked, echoing off the walls. Suddenly, shadows sprang to life, swirling around her, and she could see faces, anguished and tortured, crying out for help. "Help us! We can't escape!" In a moment of sheer terror, Laura turned and ran through the basement, the shadows chasing her, their cries echoing in her ears. She spotted an old window at the far end and rushed toward it, desperation fueling her every step. As she reached the window, she heard the door behind her creak open. The voices grew louder, and she could feel the cold breath of the shadows on her neck. With a final push, she heaved herself through the window and tumbled outside, gasping for air. She was finally out of her nightmarish experience, out from captivity. Extreme fatigue took over her. She had used her last ounce of strength to free herself from the hellish place. Now she was safe, or at least it seemed so. She could not stop here. She had to go on. She needed to steer completely clear of this damn place. Laura lay on the ground, heart racing, and looked back at the building. The shadows swirled in the doorway, screaming for her to return. She scrambled to her feet and ran, not stopping until she reached her car. As she drove away, the screams faded, but she knew she would never forget the faces in the shadows, forever trapped in that haunted asylum. The last call. Lila took a deep breath as she settled into her chair at the small, dimly lit dispatch center. The clock ticked past midnight, marking the beginning of her night shift. As a dispatcher for the city's emergency services, her job often meant long hours in solitude, punctuated only by the occasional call. Most nights, this routine was comforting, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with an unshakable tension, as if something ominous lurked just outside the walls. At first, the night was uneventful. Lila monitored the radio, glancing occasionally at the rows of blinking lights on her console. She found herself thinking about her recent breakup and how lonely the nights had become since then. The hum of the machines and the distant sounds of the city outside were the only reminders that life continued beyond the confines of her office. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. Unit 42, we have a report of a disturbance at 27th and Maple. Suspected domestic violence. Respond ASAP. Lila grabbed her headset, her heart racing as she relayed the information to the nearest unit. As they sped away, she felt a flicker of excitement, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Minutes later, another call came in, this one more urgent. Dispatch, we need backup at 14th and Oak. There's a man with a knife. He's threatening people on the street. Lila quickly dispatched more units to the scene, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she worked to coordinate the response. Her mind raced with images of chaos, wondering what kind of person would resort to such violence. After that call, a strange stillness settled over the center. Lila glanced at the clock. It was nearing 1 a.m. The unsettling feeling in her gut returned, stronger this time. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just the late hour playing tricks on her mind. Then, without warning, the phone rang. It was unusual for it to ring directly, but she answered, her voice steady. Dispatch. A raspy voice came through, low and distorted. Help me. The words sent chills down her spine. Who is this? She demanded, trying to remain calm. Please, they're coming for me, the voice pleaded, barely above a whisper. Can you tell me your location? Lila asked, her heart pounding. Silence. Hello? Are you still there? Help me, the voice repeated, more urgent this time. They're in the house. Stay on the line. I'm dispatching units to your location right now. Lila felt a rush of fear. She could hear muffled sounds in the background, furniture scraping against the floor, a woman's cry for help. Suddenly, the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Panic surged within her as she tried to call back, but the line was busy. She quickly pulled up the caller ID, but saw only a blocked number. Damn it, she muttered, her hands shaking. She had to act fast. She dispatched officers to a nearby area, instructing them to check every house. We received a call about a woman in distress. It could be a domestic situation, and she sounded terrified. As she waited for a response, Lila's mind raced. Who was that woman? Why had the call cut off? The unease she'd felt earlier morphed into something far more sinister. Minutes felt like hours as she sat in the stillness, the only sound the ticking of the clock. The radio remained silent, and her thoughts spiraled into dark places. What if they didn't find her? What if something terrible was happening right now? Finally, a response came over the radio. Dispatch, we're at 14th and Oak, but there's no sign of a disturbance. The street is quiet. Can you give us more details on the call? Lila felt her stomach drop. It was from a blocked number. A woman was in danger. She said they were in the house. Please check every residence. Roger that, dispatch, the officer replied. Just as she thought hope was fading, her phone rang again. She answered immediately. Dispatch. This time, it was the same raspy voice, but it was more frantic. You have to help me. They're in the house. I can see them. Where are you? Lila asked, her heart racing. I don't know. They won't let me leave. Stay on the line. We're sending help. Please, you don't understand. They're coming for you too. Lila's blood ran cold as she realized the implication. Who is coming? The shadows. They're watching you. The line went dead again. Panic surged within her. She looked around the dispatch center, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Stay calm, she whispered to herself. You're safe here. But the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave her. She checked the security feeds, but all the cameras were functioning normally. She knew she had to focus on the woman's safety. Desperate, Lila sent another message to the officers. Units 5 and 12, check the surrounding houses for any signs of a disturbance. A woman is in distress, and we need to find her immediately. Just as she hit send, The power flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting an eerie glow. Her heart raced as she fumbled for her flashlight, feeling a wave of dread wash over her. "Stay calm," she told herself. "You can handle this." But as she made her way through the dispatch center, the shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt a chill run through her. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, and a voice came through, frantic and urgent. "Dispatch, we found her, but it's not what you think." "What do you mean?" Lila asked, her heart pounding. "She's gone. There's no one here. Just blood everywhere." Lila felt her breath hitch in her throat. "What do you mean?" "Dispatch, there's a body. We need backup. Get out of there, now." As she spoke, the lights flickered again, and Lila caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows. Panic surged through her, and she rushed toward the front door, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the dispatch center. Just as she reached for the door, it swung open violently, and she stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The shadowy figure stood in the doorway, blocking her exit. "Help me," the figure rasped, its voice the same as the woman from the phone. Lila's heart raced as she realized what was happening. You're not real," she shouted, scrambling back. But the figure took a step closer, its face obscured by darkness. "You shouldn't have ignored the warnings. They're coming for you, just like they came for her." In that moment, Lila understood. The calls, the shadows, they were all connected. She had been warned, but she hadn't heeded the signs. With a burst of adrenaline, Lila grabbed her radio. "Help! I need backup now. I'm in the dispatch center, and I'm being attacked." The figure lunged toward her, and she rolled away just in time, scrambling to her feet. She dashed for the emergency exit, praying she could escape this nightmare. The door swung open, and she burst into the cool night air. As she ran, she could hear the sounds of chaos behind her, the laughter of unseen figures echoing in the darkness. "Stay away!" she shouted, her voice hoarse as she sprinted toward her car. Just as she reached it, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there. Panic surged within her as she jumped into the car, fumbling for the keys. Please work!" The engine roared to life, and she slammed the gear into drive, speeding away from the dispatch center. As she drove, she could see the shadows in her rearview mirror, following her like a pack of wolves. "You can't escape," a voice whispered in the back of her mind. With every turn, the shadows seemed to close in, the laughter growing louder. "You're one of us now," they taunted. But Lila refused to give in. She had to get away, to find safety. She drove through the empty streets, adrenaline coursing through her veins as she fought to escape the darkness that threatened to consume her. Reflections of terror. As the clock struck midnight, Jessica settled into her familiar chair at the small reception desk of the old, dimly lit hospital. The rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses provided a strange comfort. Working the night shift at Mercy Memorial was something she had grown accustomed to, though it never ceased to feel eerie. The hospital was quieter than usual that night, with fewer patients than expected. The emergency room had been slow, and the few souls that passed through seemed to drift like ghosts, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Jessica glanced at the patient log. Most rooms were empty, but room 212 had a new patient, a young woman named Lily, brought in after a car accident. Jessica hoped she was okay. Just then, the intercom crackled to life. "Jessica, can you check on room 12? The doctor wants to make sure she's stable." "On it," she replied, her voice steady despite a flutter of nerves in her stomach. The long, sterile corridor felt colder than usual as she made her way toward Lily's room. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly above her, casting brief shadows that danced along the walls, but she brushed off the unease creeping up her spine. Pushing open the door, Jessica stepped inside. The sight was both heart-wrenching and hopeful. Lily lay in the bed, her head bandaged and her skin pale, but she was alive. Monitors beeped steadily, and an IV drip flowed quietly. Jessica took a deep breath, relieved, and noted the young woman's vitals were stable. "Hey, Lily," Jessica whispered softly, even though she knew the girl was unconscious. "You're gonna be okay. Help is here." As she turned to leave, something caught her eye, a flicker of movement from the corner of the room. Jessica glanced back, but the room appeared still. Shaking off the sensation, she left to return to her desk. Minutes later, the phone rang, startling her. She answered quickly. Mercy Memorial, Jessica speaking. Jessica, it's Dr. Hall. I need you to keep an eye on Lily. There's something about her case that doesn't sit right with me. I'll be there in a few minutes. His words sent a shiver down her spine. Of course, doctor. I'll be right there. After hanging up, she felt an inexplicable sense of dread wash over her. She walked back to room 212, pushing the door open cautiously. This time, as she entered, she felt an unsettling weight in the air. The monitors were beeping steadily, but as she approached the bed, she noticed something odd. The IV drip had stopped. Panic surged through her as she rushed to check the connections. Suddenly, Lily's eyes fluttered open and she stared straight at Jessica, her gaze filled with an unsettling intensity. Help me, Lily croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. She won't let me go. Who? Jessica asked, her heart racing. The room felt suffocatingly small, and the shadows seemed to shift in the corners. Lily's lips trembled, and she struggled to speak. The woman in the mirror. She's watching me. She wants my soul. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. Lily, just breathe. You're safe here. I'll get the doctor. But as she turned to leave, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a heartbeat before returning. When the lights stabilized, Jessica turned back to Lily, but the girl was now sitting upright, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she were no longer the same person. Don't look in the mirror, Lily screamed suddenly, her voice echoing unnaturally. She'll take you too. Jessica's heart raced as she backed away, her mind spinning. She felt a surge of panic as she realized the small mirror hanging on the wall was now reflecting more than just the room. It seemed to ripple, distorting the image of Lily, twisting it into something grotesque. A dark figure loomed behind Lily's reflection, its features obscured and indistinct, but its presence was suffocating. Get away from her, Jessica shouted, her voice trembling. She turned to grab the emergency button on the wall, but as she did, she heard a chilling laughter echoing from the mirror. In a moment of sheer desperation, Jessica lunged for the switch, pressing it repeatedly. The lights flickered again, but the laughter only grew louder, drowning out her thoughts. The figure in the mirror smiled wider, its shadow stretching impossibly toward Lily. Then the lights went out completely. Jessica felt her heart hammering in the silence. She stumbled backward, and just as she thought she would collide with the wall, the lights flickered back on. In that fleeting moment of illumination, she saw the figure standing beside Lily. Its dark eyes locked onto her. Panic surged through her as she realized it wasn't just a reflection. The woman was real, and she was here. Help me. Lily whispered again, but this time her voice was filled with despair, as if she had lost all hope. Jessica felt the air grow colder, and an unseen force pushed her back, making it hard to breathe. She turned to flee, but the door slammed shut in front of her. Frantically, she pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Let me out, she shouted, terror flooding her voice. She turned back to Lily, whose expression was filled with fear and agony, as if she were being consumed by the presence next to her. You shouldn't have come here. Lily wailed, her voice blending with the other woman's chilling laughter. She'll take you too. In a fit of desperation, Jessica glanced back at the mirror, where the woman now stood fully formed, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to draw in the light around her. You're mine now, she hissed, her voice like ice. Jessica felt a rush of adrenaline. She couldn't let this happen. Summoning her courage, she turned back to the door and pounded on it with all her strength. Help! Somebody help! Suddenly, the door flew open, and Dr. Hall rushed in, followed by a couple of nurses. They froze at the sight before them. Lily lay back in bed, her eyes wide with fear, while the sinister figure had vanished back into the mirror. Jessica, what happened? Dr. Hall shouted, confusion etched on his face. She was right there, Jessica cried, pointing frantically at the mirror. The woman, she was trying to take Lily. The doctors and nurses exchanged worried glances as they moved to Lily's side. Lily, can you hear me? Dr. Hall asked, his voice calm but firm. You're safe now. Jessica felt her heart pounding, her mind racing with disbelief. Was it all in her head? She glanced at the mirror, half expecting the figure to reappear, but it remained just a plain piece of glass reflecting the chaos of the room. "I need to run a full assessment," Dr. Hall said, focusing on Lily. "We'll get you stabilized." As they worked on Lily, Jessica took a step back, trying to catch her breath. She felt the weight of the night settle in, the terror still fresh in her mind. Whatever had happened, she knew it wasn't over. The woman in the mirror was real, and she would come back. Jessica left the room, heart racing, knowing that the night shift was far from over. But as she walked down the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike.